Trace Hemlow sat at the plank breakfast table at Widow Ansell's boarding house at 8 in the morning of a Tuesday in May, and watched the young widow who had been on credit for 4 days feed her small daughter a piece of buttered brown bread with a plain, steady patience, and he made up his mind. He was 35, sun-brown, in a plain wool coat. He was in Denver for the spring stock auction. He would go home to his ranch at Larkin on Thursday. He said, from 3 seats down the table, "Ma'am?" The young widow looked up. She was 30. Her name was Fern Callow. He had learned it from Widow Ansell the previous night, when the widow had sat him down at the plank table alone at 10, and had told him the plain shape of the guest in the West Room. A widow of Independence, Missouri, arrived Friday with her son Wilkin, 6, and her daughter Millie, 3, on the Denver stage, robbed by a pickpocket at the Kit Carson wayside, arriving in Denver with 16 cents, only to find that her cousin, whose invitation had brought her, had died of a lung sickness the previous Tuesday, and whose small Denver room had already been rented out to another party. The widow was, for the moment, on Widow Ansell's Christian credit. She had been at Widow Ansell's 4 days. She had been asking at every mercantile counter in Denver for honest work. She was, that morning, planning to walk to the wagon master's office to ask if any wagon train would take her as a cook in exchange for passage anywhere. Widow Ansell had said, at 10 the previous night, in Trace's plain hearing, "Mr. Hemlow, she is a plain, honest woman. Her son is a plain, honest, small man. Her daughter is a plain, honest, small girl. If you have any use for a housekeeper at Larkin, I would ask you plainly to consider her before the wagon train." Trace Hemlow had said, "Ma'am, I have use." Widow Ansell had said, "Good." Trace Hemlow, now, at the plank breakfast table on Tuesday morning, said, "Ma'am, my name is Trace Hemlow. I run the Hemlow Ranch 6 miles out of Larkin, which is a day's ride from Denver. I am here for the spring stock auction. Mrs. Ansell told me last night, in your absence, the plain shape of your Friday. I have been thinking about it since. I have need of a housekeeper for my ranch. My Aunt Sylvia has been keeping it since my wife died in '82, but is turning 68 this fall, and would like to move to St. Louis to live with her sister. I would like to offer you the position at a plain, honest wage of $8 a week, and board for you and the children. I would not press you. Would you consider it?" Fern Callow set the piece of buttered brown bread down carefully in front of Millie. She looked at Trace Hemlow across the plank table. She said, "Mr. Hemlow, I would consider it. Please tell me the plain shape of the position." Trace said, "Kitchen, laundry, mending, ledger, if you can keep a ledger, general household. The ranch is a plain quarter section, with a crew of 4 hands, and my aunt for the transition. Aunt Sylvia will stay 6 weeks after your arrival to teach you the household. She has already been asking me to find her replacement. If Aunt Sylvia approves of you, and you approve of Aunt Sylvia, and the children are content, the position is yours, as long as you would like it." Fern said, "Mr. Hemlow, may I speak to your Aunt Sylvia by wire before deciding?" Trace said, "You may." He got up. He walked to the front desk. He wrote a plain, honest telegram to Aunt Sylvia at Larkin. He gave it to Mrs. Ansell's boy for the 11 o'clock wire. He came back to the plank table. He said, "Ma'am, the answer will come by 6 tonight." Fern said, "Thank you." Wilkin, 6, looked up at his mother and at Trace and said, quietly, "Ma'am, does the Hemlow Ranch have a barn cat?" Trace Hemlow said, "Sir, it has 2. Their names are 9 and 10, because they are the 9th and 10th barn cats my aunt has kept in 15 years, and she got tired of naming them." Wilkin said, "That is a sensible way to name barn cats." Trace said, "It is." Wilkin considered. He said, "Ma'am, I would like to move to the Hemlow Ranch." Fern Callow put her hand along her son's cheek. Aunt Sylvia's wire came at 5 in the afternoon. It said only in Aunt Sylvia's careful hand, "Trace, bring her. 68 is not 67, and I have wanted to leave since March. Sylvia." Trace showed the wire to Fern at the plank table at 6. Fern said, "Mr. Hemlow, I accept the position." Trace said, "Good." He drove her to Larkin on Thursday morning in his own buckboard after the stock auction closed. Wilkin sat between them. Millie slept in Fern's lap under a folded quilt. They reached Larkin at dusk. Aunt Sylvia, 68, thin, brisk, in a plain green Sunday dress, met the wagon in the yard. Aunt Sylvia said, "Nephew." Trace said, "Aunt." Aunt Sylvia said, "Mrs. Callow." Fern said, "Miss Hemlow." Aunt Sylvia said, "Sylvia, please, if we are to be 6 weeks in the same kitchen." Fern said, "Fern." Aunt Sylvia said, "Wilkin, Millie, please come with me. I have made a small supper. Nephew, help Fern with the trunks." They went in. Fern learned the ranch inside 4 weeks. She learned the plank table, the pantry, the small ledger of Aunt Sylvia's accounts, the 2 barn cats, and the crew of 4 hands. She learned the small brown mare Aunt Sylvia kept for herself, and the 15-year-old boy Rufe who ran errands. She learned that Trace Hemlow, 35, had lost his wife Rachel in a fever in 82, that he had not, in the 4 years since, remarried, and that he was, in Aunt Sylvia's plain judgment, a plain honest man who had been quietly hoping for a plain honest wife who understood a plank table. Aunt Sylvia said all this, plainly, to Fern at the plank table on the 5th Sunday, in Trace's absence at the barn. Fern said, "Sylvia." Sylvia said, "Fern." Fern said, "I have been a plain, honest housekeeper of 5 weeks. I have not been thinking about the plainer thing." Sylvia said, "I have been thinking about it since your 3rd supper. Trace has been thinking about it since your 1st. He is not a man to press. He will not. He would be gently obliged if you would consider it in your own time." Fern said, "I will consider it." Sylvia said, "Good. Now do not tell my nephew I told you." Fern said, "I would not." Sylvia said, "He is a plain, honest man. I raised him. I know his shape. I would rather I told you than left it to him to stumble across." Fern said, "Sylvia, thank you." Sylvia said, "You are welcome." Aunt Sylvia left for St. Louis on the 14th of July with a plain, honest hug for Fern, and a plain, honest hug for Trace, and a plain, honest kiss on the top of Wilkin's head, and a plain, honest small squeeze of Millie's cheek. She said, "At the depot, nephew, be brave." Trace said, "Yes, Aunt Sylvia." On the 3rd Sunday of August, at the plank table after supper, when Wilkin and Millie were both in the west room asleep, and the crew were at the bunkhouse, Trace Hemlow said, "Fern." Fern said, "Trace." He said, "May I say a plain thing?" She said, "Please." He said, "I have been thinking since your 1st supper. I have not said anything since your 1st supper, because I did not want to press. Aunt Sylvia told me the day before she left that she had told you the same thing. I did not know then that she had. I know now. I would like to marry you, Fern Callow. And I would like to raise Wilkin and Millie as my own children. And I would like you to know that if that is welcome, it is very welcome to me. And if it is not welcome, it is not. And I will keep our arrangement plainly, and never mention this at the plank table again." Fern Callow looked at Trace Hemlow across her own plank table. She said, "Trace." He said, "Yes." She said, "Yes." The circuit preacher married Trace Hemlow and Fern Callow in the front room of the Hemlow Ranch on the last Sunday of September. Aunt Sylvia rode back from St. Louis for it. Widow Ansel rode up from Denver in a rented buckboard. Wilkin, 6½, gave Fern away, because Trace and Aunt Sylvia and Widow Ansel had all told him, plainly, that he had been the head of the Callow household since his father's death, and it was his to give. Wilkin, in his small best coat, walked his mother down the 4 steps of the parlor and handed her, gravely, to Trace Hemlow. He said, in a plain, honest, small voice, that Aunt Sylvia had helped him practice for a week, "Mr. Hemlow, please take good care of my mother. I have been trying my best." Trace Hemlow went down on one knee. He said, "Wilkin, I will." Wilkin nodded and stepped back. 2 years on a warm September evening at the Hemlow Ranch, Fern Hemlow sat on the porch step with Trace beside her and a small son called Tracy, 10 months old, asleep against her chest. Wilkin, 8.5, was reading a McGuffey third to Millie on the porch bench in a plain, careful older brother voice. Millie, 5, listened in the plain, rapt way that older brothers deserve. Aunt Sylvia was on her second visit of the year, from St. Louis, sitting in the porch rocker with a bit of muslin she was mending, and pretending she had not planned her visit to coincide with Tracy's second christening. Widow Ansel of Denver had, in April of the previous year, been made an honorary aunt of the Hemlow household. She had a room at the ranch always waiting for her. She had, in fact, come up in June for 2 weeks. She had eaten Fern's peach pie every night. Trace said, "Fern." Fern said, "Trace." He said, "Wilkin was working the north fence with Roof this morning. He drove a fence staple straight the first try. Roof told me at supper." Roof said, "Boss, that boy is going to be a plain, honest man." Fern said, "He is." Trace kissed his wife's temple. Aunt Sylvia, from the rocker, said, "Nephew." "Nephew." Trace said, "Aunt Sylvia." Aunt Sylvia said, "I did well." Trace said, "You did, Aunt Sylvia." Aunt Sylvia said, "Do not say I did not." Trace said, "I would not, Aunt Sylvia." Aunt Sylvia said, "Good." The pasture went to gold. Wilkin read the McGuffey. Millie listened. Tracy slept. And Fern Callow Hemlow, who had watched her purse leave with a pickpocket at the Kit Carson wayside on a Wednesday afternoon in May, and had arrived in Denver on a Friday with 2 children and 16 cents, and had learned within an hour that her cousin was dead, put her cheek against her husband's shoulder, and understood that the good slow country had, in its good slow way, arranged a Denver widow's Christian credit at a Denver boarding house and a Larkin rancher's spring stock auction to intersect exactly on a Tuesday morning at a plank breakfast table, and had, on the strength of one plain honest wire, to a 68-year-old aunt at Larkin, given her back not just the $8 a week of a plain housekeeper's wage, but the whole rest of a household under a plain rancher's roof, she had not, in her Missouri widowhood, believed possible. And so it had been.